In the mid-1900s, the United States was going through one of the largest political movements in history. Slavery had been abolished, but African Americans were still the target of fierce racism and oppression. Just as the civil rights movement was beginning, a young 27-year-old black man by the name of Malcolm Little was released from prison. At the time, Malcolm was just another unknown black man that was trying to turn his life around after a hard childhood. But he would soon become one of the most powerful, influential, and important leaders in civil rights history. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm X took a stand by opposing the mainstream nonviolent civil rights marches and protests, leading people through the civil rights movement using his famous by any means necessary approach, and leaving a legacy that has inspired people through generations. Malcolm's childhood was not easy. Due to his father often speaking out against racism, his family was the target of many white supremacist groups. For a while, Malcolm's family managed to avoid these groups by constantly moving, but when Malcolm was 4, his house in Lansing, Michigan was burned down by members of the Black Legion. 2 years later, Malcolm's father was killed when he was run over by a streetcar, with the family claiming he had been murdered by white supremacists. Despite all the challenges he faced, in the years after his father's death, Malcolm was doing quite well. He excelled in school and had a passion for learning. That is, until something happened that would change his life. When Malcolm was in 8th grade, his teacher approached him, saying he was one of the smartest African American kids he had ever taught, and asked him what he wanted to do for a career. Malcolm told his teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer. His teacher then laughed at him and told him to choose something more realistic for a black man. After this, Malcolm lost his passion for education and dropped out of school as soon as he could. When he was 15, he moved to live with his sister in Boston and then New York, where he got into street crime to make a living. When Malcolm was 20, he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Being in prison was one of the most important times of Malcolm X's life. At first, Malcolm resisted authorities and refused to follow instructions, but after discovering the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad, he decided to turn his life around. He spent the rest of his years in prison reading and educating himself through books. After being paroled 7 years into his sentence, Malcolm became a Muslim and joined the Nation of Islam, where he got rid of his last name and replaced it with the famous X.
We completely reject the last name of the white man. And since we don't know the surnames that our people had when they came to this country, we used an X. And that X will stand, as we're taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, until God comes at the end of the world and gives us a name out of his own mouth.
Soon after joining the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X began to gain power. He quickly became a critical spokesperson and a powerful leader. At the same time, Malcolm started his work as a human rights activist. Like most civil rights leaders, Malcolm's goal was for the African American population to have equal rights and power as the white population. However, Malcolm's ideas on how equality should be reached were very different from the ideas of most other civil rights leaders. Unlike most leaders who supported full integration, when Malcolm was in the Nation of Islam, he believed that integration wouldn't give the African Americans the rights they were looking for. Instead, Malcolm believed that by fully separating the two races, so that the black population would be living in an all-black country of their own, the race problem would be solved.
Having an opportunity to ride either on the front or the back or in the middle of someone else's bus doesn't dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you have dignity.
While Malcolm would go on to change his views on integration, there was one major thing that stuck with him all throughout his work as a civil rights leader: his stand for using violence to gain rights.
If you want freedom, then you should get freedom like Patrick Henry said, by whatever method is necessary. If you are not willing to pay the price for freedom, you don't deserve freedom.
Malcolm challenged the nonviolent approach that most civil rights leaders were taking. Instead of supporting Martin Luther King Jr.'s turn the other cheek and suffer peacefully ideas, Malcolm thought that after all the violence and racism that African Americans had gone through over the years, a black person had the right to defend himself against a white person, and should do so. Malcolm X's more radical stand appealed greatly to a large amount of the black population, especially black youth. These people wanted respect, rights, and full equality, and wanted it fast. Malcolm's ideas supported this, and gave him a huge following of people.
If you look at the times in which they lived, Malcolm had a much broader appeal to black people in America, especially in the North.
Yeah.
Okay, that whole concept of nonviolence was very hard for people to take. It was very hard for a lot of people to subscribe to.
Throughout the civil rights movement, there were two very different types of activists. You had the people who were set on doing things non-violently, and the people who were willing to do whatever it takes, including using violence, to gain their rights the fastest. The non-violent group always had plenty of leaders such as MLK and Rosa Parks to follow. However, people who didn't think that non-violent actions would gain African Americans their rights didn't really have anyone to follow. That is, until Malcolm stood up and became a leader for those people. Malcolm's by any means necessary mentality was widely accepted by all the people that wanted to get involved in civil rights, but just didn't fit in with the nonviolent movement. Not only did these people support Malcolm, they were willing to do almost anything he said, making him one of the most powerful civil rights leaders in history. The huge extent of Malcolm's power can easily be seen in events like the Johnson-Hinton incident. In 1957, Johnson Hinton, a member of Malcolm X's mosque, was walking through Harlem when he was beaten and arrested by police for helping another black man. Malcolm and a small group of followers went to the station where Hinton was being kept and demanded for him to receive treatment at a hospital. By the time police brought Hinton to the hospital, Malcolm's small group had grown to around 4,000 people, all demanding Hinton to receive proper medical care and for him to be released from the station. After police agreed to Malcolm's terms, Malcolm waved his hand and the crowd was gone. Malcolm X's work in the Nation of Islam continued, where his following only grew. But at the beginning of 1964, things started to change. Malcolm started to disagree with some of Elijah Muhammad's ideas and eventually left the Nation of Islam. After leaving, Malcolm went on a religious trip to Mecca, known as the Hajj. In Mecca, Malcolm experienced for the first time people of all races being together and not judging each other by the color of their skin. These experiences caused Malcolm to change his views and support integration in America. Malcolm wrote about his experiences in his famous Letter from Mecca, saying he saw a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. Now that Malcolm X was out of the Nation of Islam, he was spending almost all of his time pushing for full integration in America. Malcolm continued giving speeches where he advocated using violence in self-defense, but also criticized the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. However, this stand against the Nation of Islam would come back to haunt him when his house was firebombed by Nation of Islam members. A week later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was shot and killed while giving a speech by Nation of Islam member Thomas Hagen. Like most leaders throughout history, Malcolm X's stand continued long after his death. Malcolm's work influenced many people and was the foundation for the Black Panther Party, a group that would continue Malcolm's work long after his death. The two founders of the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, were huge supporters of Malcolm X. Seale said that Malcolm was the most powerful speaker there was, and Newton claimed that the Black Panthers was a living testament to Malcolm's life work. The Black Panther Party was created around Malcolm X's ideas that violence should be used in self-defense. After Malcolm died, the group stepped up, giving his followers new leaders that would continue spreading Malcolm's ideas. Malcolm X influenced many people like Newton and Seale during his time, which helped continue his stand throughout the civil rights movement. Malcolm X was a major part of the civil rights movement. He took a stand by using a different approach to gaining equality, which caused thousands of more people to get involved in the movement. His speeches and teachings were powerful and inspired many. Without Malcolm, it's very possible that the civil rights movement wouldn't have been as successful as it was. Although some criticize him for advocating violence, Malcolm grew up seeing nothing but violence and hate from the white man. Malcolm only knew one way that would stop that, and it was to fight back. In many ways, Malcolm X changed and moved forward the civil rights movement, and today, more than 50 years after his death, his work is still inspiring people to finish what he, Martin Luther King Jr., and other civil rights leaders started.